Wyoming Territory. 1879, the sun had barely cracked the ridge when they dragged Nathaniel Fry behind the barn and tore the shirt clean off his back. He did not cry out. Not when the first lash came. Not when the third tore skin. He kept his jaw locked, eyes fixed on the dirt, blood soaking into the dry earth beneath him. The men doing it were ranch hands from the Bar J, men he had worked beside for 6 months. But now they treated him like a traitor, all because he had refused to brand her, Clementine Harlow. She had been brought in the night before, roped and tied like a steer, eyes wide and proud with fury. They said she was a runaway. Some man out of Cheyenne claimed her as his indentured property, said she owed 5 years of labor. He had papers. They always had papers. But Nathaniel did not believe in branding women. Not even if the law said she could be claimed like cattle. When he refused, they called him soft. Then they decided to make an example of him. He stayed conscious through the whipping, barely. When they finally left him, groaning and soaked in blood, the cold dirt pressed to his cheek, he saw her standing at the edge of the barn. She had slipped her bindings. There was blood on her wrists where the rope had rubbed raw. "You fool," she muttered, crouching beside him. "Why would you do that?" He opened one eye, his voice a rasp. "Because you ain't livestock." She stared at him for a long beat, then she gripped under his arm and hauled him up. "I am not leaving you here. You do not even know me. You took pain for me. That is all I need to know." Nathaniel's legs gave out, but she caught him. She was strong for someone so lean. She had no horse, no food, and no real plan. But she got him on his feet, dragged him to the edge of the property and into the cottonwoods by the river. They walked when he could, rested when he could not. By nightfall they found an abandoned trapper's hut, half collapsed but dry. She cleaned his wounds, tearing strips from her own dress to bind them. He watched her hands as she worked. They trembled just a little, but she never stopped. "What is your name?" he asked, voice hoarse. "Clementine," she said softly. "Clementine Harlow." He tried to sit up. She pressed him back down. "You are gonna have scars," she said. "Scars mean I did something worth remembering," he said. She looked away quick, but he saw the shine in her eyes. By morning he could sit up on his own. She brought him water from the river, found wild raspberries, and even caught a fish with her bare hands. He watched her move, focused, steady. She had not cried once. "How long were you with him, the man who claimed you?" he asked. "Too long," she said. 2 years. He said I owed him for taking me in after my father died, but I did not ask for his help. "You got family?" "None left." She glanced at him. "You," Nathaniel hesitated, "had a wife. She died with the baby. Montana winter took them both." Clementine's eyes softened just a little. "And now you get whipped for a stranger." He met her gaze. "You did not feel like a stranger." They stayed in the hut 3 days, long enough for Nathaniel to walk without falling. Clementine found a mule wandering by the river, likely a drifter's that broke loose. She patched together a saddle and packed what little they had. "Where will we go?" he asked. "There is a town west of here, Elk Hollow. I heard they do not ask questions." They rode slow. Nathaniel leaned forward on the mule, teeth clenched through every bump. Clementine walked beside, hand on the reins, always checking on him. They reached Elk Hollow by dusk 2 days later. It was a small place, barely 10 buildings, a church and a mercantile. But the sheriff was a quiet man who looked the other way when Clementine said, "We are passing through." They found a room behind the smithy. The woman who owned it, Miss Walker, had seen the wounds on Nathaniel's back and said nothing, only handed over clean linens and a tin of salve. That night, Nathaniel lay face down on the cot, breath shallow. Clementine sat beside him, her fingers brushing his shoulder. "You saved me," she said quietly. He turned his head to see her. "You saved yourself. I just got in the way." She smiled faintly. You did not have to help me, and you sure did not have to bleed for it. I could not watch them hurt you." She looked down, her hand still resting on his arm. "I have not had anyone stand up for me in a long time." Nathaniel reached up and took her hand in his. "You do not have to run anymore, not alone." They sat like that for a long while, no more words between them. By the end of the week, Nathaniel could stand on his own. He found work with the blacksmith, shoeing horses and hauling feed. Clementine helped Miss Walker run the boarding house, baking bread and keeping the books. No one asked about their past. No one needed to. One morning, Nathaniel came down the stairs and found Clementine outside, sleeves rolled, hauling water from the pump. He just watched her for a minute. She turned, caught him looking, and smiled. "What? You look free," he said. "I am." He stepped closer. "I want to stay here with you." Her breath caught. "I would like that." He touched her face, fingers grazing her cheek. "I still do not know everything about you," he said. "You know enough." And then she kissed him soft and sure, like she had wanted to for days, and finally let herself be brave. Nathaniel pulled her close, arms gentle around her waist, and kissed her back. In that moment, nothing else mattered. Not the scars on his back. Not the man who tried to own her. Just the two of them standing in the sun, finding something new, something real. They had no vows, no preacher, no ring. But from that day forward, she was his and he was hers, and they both knew neither of them would ever be alone again. Clementine stood ankle-deep in the creek, skirts hitched above her knees, steadying the tin pail as water rushed around her boots. The air smelled of wet stone and pine bark, and somewhere upstream a bird called out once, sharp and distant. The sun was still low, gold through the branches, and it was the first morning in weeks she hadn't woken with her heart pounding. From the rise above the creek, Nathaniel's voice reached her. "You reckon Miss Walker'll mind me borrowing her hammer?" She turned, shading her eyes. He stood near the stump where someone long ago had split wood, one hand resting on his hip, the other lifting the tool in question. His shirt hung open at the throat where the top two buttons were missing, and the skin beneath was still healing, pink and ridged. "She'll mind if you don't bring it back," Clementine said. "She counts every last nail. I'll be real careful then." "You better. She's got more opinions than teeth." Nathaniel chuckled under his breath and turned back toward the smithy. Clementine watched him go, the way he favored his left side when he walked, how he paused every so often to breathe deep before lifting anything heavier than a sack of oats. He was stronger than he looked, not by muscle, but by sheer will. She'd seen the way he kept moving even when his skin broke open again beneath his shirt. He never complained. By the time she returned to the boarding house, her sleeves were damp and her arms ached from hauling water, but Miss Walker had already set out a bowl of cornmeal and a pail of lard. Clementine rolled her sleeves higher and reached for the flour. "You hear the preacher's coming down from Laramie next week." Miss Walker didn't look up from her sewing. "Could marry a cat to a fence post if someone asked." "I didn't reckon cats had much say in the matter," Clementine said, dusting her hands. "I reckon they don't. But sometimes folks just need a reason to stay put." Clementine didn't answer. Her hands moved without thought, kneading, shaping, patting the dough flat. She wasn't sure what to make of the question tucked behind Miss Walker's words. Later that day, she brought a parcel down to the smithy, wrapped in brown paper and tied with twine. Nathaniel sat out front, hammer resting on his thigh, boots dusty, face streaked with soot. "What's that?" he asked. "Bread. Still warm." He set the hammer down and wiped his hands on his trousers before taking it. "You didn't have to. I know." He opened the parcel slowly, careful not to tear the paper. The crust was golden, the smell sweet and sharp. He broke off a piece and held it out to her. "You eat first," she said. He took a bite, chewed, swallowed. Best thing I've had in years. You say that like you've had worse. I have. Once tried to cook beans in a tin that still had paint in it, lost my voice for 2 days. She laughed, sudden and unguarded, the sound surprising them both. I didn't think you'd ever been foolish, she said. I've been worse than foolish. I've been bitter. Mean once or twice, but never cruel. She met his eyes. That's why I stayed. Nathaniel looked down at the crust in his hand. I keep thinking about what I would have done if you hadn't pulled me out of that place. I didn't think. I just moved. You could have kept walking. I'd done enough of that. Silence stretched between them, not heavy but full, the kind that settled when nothing more needed to be said. I've been thinking about taking work up at the Hart place, he said after a while. They need help mending fences before winter. Pays better than the forge, and I can do it sitting down most days. You think your back can take it? Not yet. But it will. I won't let it stop me. She nodded once. You do what you need. Just don't go forgetting where your bed is. His gaze lingered on her face. I couldn't if I tried. That night the wind shifted. The dry heat of midsummer broke, and a cool breath came down from the mountains. Clementine lit a fire in the small hearth and left the door open, letting the scent of pine drift in. Nathaniel came in late, boots in hand, shirt stained with clay dust. He crossed the room quietly, as if unsure whether she was awake. You can sit, she said without turning. I didn't want to wake you. You didn't. He lowered himself into the chair across from her. The fire threw long shadows up the wall, catching the lines of his face, the sharpness of his jaw. I used to think I'd end up alone, he said. Clementine didn't answer. She waited. Not out of choice, just because I never gave anyone reason to stay. I worked, I kept to myself. The world didn't ask much of me after I buried them. I didn't offer much back. She watched the fire crackle, listening. Then you, he said. You didn't ask for anything either. But you stayed. I didn't think you needed saving, she said. I just knew you shouldn't be left. He looked over at her, eyes quiet and steady. I want to build something, a place, something that's ours, not just borrowed rooms and borrowed firewood. Something we made. She leaned forward, her elbows on her knees. You mean to start a home? I do. She didn't speak right away. The fire popped once and the room went still again. Then you'd better find land before the frost sets in. I'm not going to live in a tent, he grinned, slow and sure. You'd come with me. I'm not letting you cook beans in painted tins again. He reached across the space between them and took her hand. She didn't pull away. Clem, he said, voice low. She met his eyes, her fingers tightening around his. I'm right here, Nate. And when he leaned in, she didn't stop him. The kiss wasn't hurried. It was quiet, a breath shared between them, the kind that said not just want but promise. The kind that settled something inside her she hadn't even known was restless. When they pulled apart, she rested her forehead against his. We'll make it, she whispered. He nodded. We already are. By mid-September, the aspens behind Elk Hollow turned yellow, and the chill in the mornings clung longer, mist rising off the creek like breath from a sleeping animal. Nathaniel had started helping the Hart family just outside town, fixing the outer fence line and sealing cracks in the barn roof. Clementine packed him bread and boiled eggs wrapped in cloth each morning, tied with twine and tucked into his coat pocket. One evening, he returned later than usual, his shoulders stiff from the ride and dirt caked along the hem of his trousers. Clementine was out back behind Miss Walker's, hanging linens between two posts when she heard the mule's hooves. You're losing the light, she called without turning. Nathaniel dismounted carefully. Fence post gave me more fight than a bull. Took half the day to dig it out. She stepped down from the stool, wiping her hands on her apron. You ever think you might be better suited to something that doesn't involve lifting the earth? I'd sooner wrestle the earth than sit behind a desk. I never said desk. He unclasped the bundle from his coat and handed her what remained of her bread. Still warm when I ate it. You make that with lard or butter? That's mine to know. He tilted his head. I'll find out sooner or later. Clementine tied off the last rope, then turned. You're late. Stopped by the land office. That made her pause. You looking to buy? Not yet. Just asking how far west the parcels go. There's a stretch along the foothills north of the river bend. Used to be a stage stop. Burned down last year, but the well's still good. She folded her arms, watching him closely. That's 2 days' ride. Less if we cut across the flats. You thinking of dragging me out there? I wouldn't drag you anywhere, but if you wanted to see it, I'd take you. Her gaze lingered, steady and unreadable. I'd need to know there's more there than a hole in the ground. There's cottonwoods, a slope that catches morning sun, and enough flat land for a garden. Clementine didn't answer right away. He didn't press her. Inside, Miss Walker was rolling out dough for chicken pie. She didn't look up when they came in, only said, "You'll want to check the chimney before the frost. Smoke's been backing up." Nathaniel nodded. "I'll climb up tomorrow." That night, as Clementine brushed the ash from the hearthstones, he brought in a bucket of kindling and stacked it by the door. She didn't turn when she spoke. "You planning to build a house out there?" "I'd like to, once the land's mine." "You'd work it yourself. I've got no one else. You've got me." He didn't move. She turned, her palms still dusted in soot. "If we do this, if we go, it can't be halfway. I won't live in someone else's shadow." "You wouldn't be." "I need to hear it." Nathaniel's voice dropped low. "You're not a rescue, you're not a debt. You're the reason I want to build something that lasts." Silence settled between them, but it wasn't uncertain. She stepped forward, resting her hand against his chest, just above the ridge of scar tissue. "When?" "After the first frost. I'll take you to see it." She nodded once. "Then we'd better start gathering supplies." They spent the next week slowly, deliberately. Nathaniel bartered his labor for nails and hinges from the blacksmith. Clementine traded sewing for cloth, salt, and a pair of wool blankets. They marked each item off in a small ledger she kept tucked in her apron pocket. One morning, she stood before the mirror in Miss Walker's room, pinning her braid up tight. Nathaniel leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. "You ever think about what you'd be if the world hadn't gone sideways?" She didn't look at him. "I'd have been my mother's daughter. Quilts in winter, tomatoes in summer. Sundays with the hymn book and a pie cooling on the sill. You still could." "I'd like to. Not the hymn book, maybe, but the rest." He stepped inside, took the comb from her hand, and ran it gently through the end of her braid. "I'd like to see you with a garden. You'd better be ready to weed it." "I'll weed, mend, chop, and fix, if you'll stay." She met his reflection in the mirror. "I already did." When the first frost came, thin and silver on the grass, they packed the mule with what little they owned. Miss Walker handed Clementine a small tin of sugar and said nothing more than, "You keep him fed and honest." They rode west, the wind sharp and clear, the world opening wider with each mile. Clementine rode ahead, her coat buttoned tight, scarf tucked under her chin. Eyes fixed on the road that led towards something they hadn't had before, not escape, not survival, but a beginning. The trail to the riverbend land wound through low hills where the grass grew in tufts between granite outcroppings. Quail burst from the brush as the mule stepped slow and steady, one hoof after the next. Clementine rode side saddle, her back straight, wrapped in the thick wool coat they'd bartered from the trader who passed through Elk Hollow with a wagon full of second-hand goods and no patience for haggling. Nathaniel walked beside her, reins in one hand, shotgun slung across his back. The sun had risen pale and thin, and by mid-morning the frost lifted from the ground in curls of steam. "It won't look like much at first," he said, voice quiet. Fire took the roof and most of the siding, but the bones are there. I'm not here for what it was, she said. I'm here for what we'll make of it. He didn't answer, but she saw the way his fingers curled tighter around the reins. By afternoon, the land revealed itself slowly, a wide stretch between two ridgelines, a narrow stream cutting through the center, and the remains of the old stage stop crumbling against the far slope. One stone wall still stood, and beside it, a well with a rotting cover and rusted winch. Clementine dismounted without help and walked toward the ruins, boots crunching over brittle grass. She stepped inside what had once been a room and stood silent, breathing in the scent of ash and old earth. Nathaniel joined her. I'll clear it out this week. Start with a foundation before the freeze. There's time, she said. We'll do it right. He looked past the ruin toward the hills. There's game out here, rabbit, deer if you go quiet enough. Creek's got trout. Then we won't go hungry. She crouched beside the well, peeled back the rotted cover and peered inside. The rope was gone, but the stone walls held firm, and when she dropped a pebble, water answered far below with a soft echo. Nathaniel knelt beside her. We'll need to replace the winch. I saw a gear wheel in the blacksmith's scrap pile he might let go for a trade. Clementine pulled her scarf tighter against the wind. We'll take it one piece at a time. They made camp that night beneath a half-dead cottonwood. Nathaniel coaxed a fire from dry bark and pine cones, one knee resting on a flat stone, the other stiff from the day's walk. Clementine laid out jerky and cornmeal biscuits, then sat beside him, knees to her chest, watching the fire catch. You ever build a house before? She asked. No. But I watched my uncle raise one when I was a boy. He didn't have much more than a borrowed hammer and a borrowed hand. Did it last? Long enough for him to die warm in his own bed. That's all a man can ask. She turned her face toward the flames. I want a window that faces the dawn. I'll build it. And a real door, one that locks, he nodded. You'll have it. They sat without speaking for a while, the wind rattling dry leaves overhead. Nathaniel leaned back against the pack and stretched his legs, wincing as the weight pulled at his healing back. I never asked what you wanted before, he said. You weren't in any shape to ask. I'm asking now. She looked at him, searching his face in the flicker of firelight. I want to plant roots so deep nothing can pull me loose again. I want to know what it feels like to stay. Nathaniel reached for her hand, calloused and warm. He didn't say anything, just wrapped his fingers around hers and held on. The sky turned dark around them, stars bright and sharp between the branches. When the wind picked up, Clementine pulled her blanket tighter, and Nathaniel leaned closer, offering what heat he had. You reckon we'll make it through winter? She asked. We've made it through worse. I want to believe that. He looked at her, his voice steady. Then believe it. We're not going back, not to what was, not to who we were. She met his eyes. No. We're not. He brushed a strand of hair from her cheek, his fingers lingering just a second longer than they needed to. I was hollow before you, he said. I didn't know it until you filled the space. Clementine leaned forward, eyes shining, not from tears but from something steadier. You're the first thing I chose, Nathaniel, not out of fear, not out of need, just because I wanted to. He kissed her then, not with urgency but with certainty, as if sealing a promise. Her hands found the back of his neck, and she rested her forehead to his, breathing in the firelight and pine smoke. They slept that night wrapped together under the stars while the wind whispered through the grass. Come morning, they would begin. By the second week, they cleared the ash and broken beams from the old stage stop. The stone wall stood true, and Nathaniel laid a straight line of stakes for the cabin's footprint just beside it, where the ground was level and the wind broke against the slope. Clementine spent her days gathering what the land offered. She found wild onion near the creek bend and dried roots to flavor broth. In the evenings, she stitched flour sacks into curtains by firelight, humming to herself while Nathaniel carved joints into pine logs with slow precision. They didn't rush. Every choice was deliberate, every board placed with care. Late one afternoon, as the sky dimmed to a soft gray and the smell of wood shavings hung in the air, Clementine walked the ridge above the clearing with a handful of dried yarrow bundled in her apron. Nathaniel was below, hammering pegs into a crossbeam, his back to her. She knelt in the grass and pressed the yarrow into the soil. "For what's been lost," she murmured, "and what we're building in its place." When she came down, he was packing away his tools, fingers stiff from the cold. "You see anything up there?" he asked. "3 deer prints. 1 coyote, close. Not close enough to worry." He paused, brushing sawdust from his coat sleeve. "You ever think about putting something in the ground besides herbs and prayers?" Clementine tilted her head. "I mean a crop," he said. "Something to keep us through next winter. Maybe corn or squash if we can get seed." She considered. "If the frost lets up in March, we might make a late planting, but we'd need fencing. And a bucket that doesn't leak. I can trade for seed in Elk Hollow. We'll need a root cellar too. That slope behind the shed holds cool." Nathaniel nodded. "Then we'll dig before the ground hardens." The days shortened and the roof beams rose. They built with what they had pined from the low ridge, nails bartered for with harness work, and stones hauled one by one from the creek. Clementine lined the inside walls with wool scraps and flattened burlap to keep the wind out. Nathaniel hung the door on leather hinges, and when it creaked open for the first time, she stepped inside and turned a slow circle, arms crossed. "It's not perfect," he said from behind her. "It's ours," she said and smiled. The first time snow dusted the trees, they lit the hearth with dry moss and pine cones. Clementine hung the kettle, filled it with creek water and dropped in a handful of herbs. Nathaniel sat cross-legged beside the fire, warming his hands. "I never asked," he said, "what you wanted most when you were a girl." "No one ever asked," she said quietly, "but I'll tell you." She sank to the floor beside him, drawing her knees up. "I wanted to be seen, not for what I did or didn't do, just seen." He reached for her hand. "You are." She looked at him then, and there was nothing guarded in her face. "I see you too, Nate, even the parts you still keep quiet." He kissed her knuckles, slow and deliberate. "I want to marry you." She didn't flinch. "Then marry me." They rode into Elk Hollow 3 days later, the mule pulling a small cart Nathaniel had built from scrap. Clementine wore a blue shawl Miss Walker had pressed into her hands without a word. The preacher's voice was soft and brief, and when he finished, they stood silent for a long moment, hands clasped, the snow beginning to fall. Miss Walker handed Nathaniel a sack of flour and a length of smoked pork. "You feed her well and often." "I intend to," he said. That night, back at the cabin, they lit a small lantern and hung it from the rafter. The fire crackled low and the scent of cedar filled the room. Nathaniel poured water into the basin while Clementine unpinned her braid. "You nervous?" he asked, drying his hands. "No," she said. "Not a bit." She stepped to him, resting her hands on his chest. "I've been waiting for this without knowing I was." He kissed her, slow and deep, and when they lay down on the straw mattress, the world narrowed to warmth and breath and the quiet murmur of wind against wood. By spring, the earth softened. Clementine planted carrots and beans in neat rows, her skirts tucked high, hands caked in soil. Nathaniel dug the root cellar and built a pen for 3 chickens they traded for with eggs and stitching work. The cabin grew lived in. She hung her apron by the door and pressed dried leaves between the cracks in the windows. He carved a shelf above the hearth and placed a single stone on it, the first they'd pulled from the ruin. He caught her one morning watching the sunrise through the east window, her hair loose down her back. "You thinking of going somewhere?" he asked, stepping behind her. "Only forward," she said. He wrapped his arms around her waist, resting his chin on her shoulder. "Then I'll be right here for every step of it." They stayed like that, wrapped in each other, while the sun lifted over the hills and spread gold across the floorboards. Years passed. The cabin held through 3 winters, then 5. The garden grew wider, the root cellar deeper. They added a second room when the space grew tight, and Nathaniel carved a cradle from pine when Clementine's belly began to swell. They named their daughter Eliza, after no one in particular. She had Clementine's quiet eyes and Nathaniel's stubborn mouth. She walked before she ran and followed her mother into the garden, her father into the woods. They grew older but not apart. Their hair silvered together, their hands stayed calloused. They laughed more than they wept. They kept the fire burning. And every morning, Nathaniel opened the east window wide, and Clementine watched the light come in.